Hello, my name is Tracy Rassley, and I am the Programs Manager for the Montana and Wyoming chapters of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which is actually a really long title to say that I get to work, I have the privilege of working in all things prevention education and postvention support in both Montana and Wyoming with some of the most amazing volunteers that are ever out there. When a person dies by suicide, there are others around them that are deeply affected. In fact, I'm just gonna get rid of those. One study showed that about 115 people are deeply affected by that suicide. And 1 in 5 people have said that they are incredibly affected and it permeates their life. And so when we are talking about this discussion, without negating the need to go upstream and make sure that we are talking about all of the prevention education, we also need to think about our loss survivors and those with suicidal ideation. One of the things I do want to talk about today is the fact that how we talk about this truly does matter. And one of the things I want to point out is that if we are talking about a suicide, we want to talk about it as a death by suicide or someone who has taken their own life rather than using the word committed. The other thing that I want to talk about is when we are saying that someone has a suicide attempt, that's all we really need. We don't need to preface that with a successful or a failed suicide. We want to take that judgment out because that's what people are hearing when they hear that it was a successful suicide or a failed suicide. There's a lot of judgment implied in that, and for a lot of people who have made an attempt, it's one of those, oh, for crying out loud, I couldn't even do that right. And that's not what we want them to take away. Now, I say this because a lot of times people who I would think have already made these language switches haven't. And so I just want to make sure that I am touching on that as a part of this conference, because if you haven't made that language switch, I ask you to try and make that language switch for yourself. I am a loss survivor. The picture that you saw on the previous screen, that is my son, Patrick. Patrick, that picture was actually taken about 1 month and 1 week before he took his life at 19 years old. That was 9 years, 9 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days ago. That is how important that is to a loss survivor. I know down to the day. So that was on January 15th, or January 26th to 25th. Okay. Hello, lights. That was on January 25th, 2015. And what we found out after the fact is that we knew nothing about the mental health state in the United States, let alone in Montana, which is where we're from. And what we realized was that Patrick was very good at protecting other people and taking care of them. He was about 6 foot tall, 250 or 230 pounds, depending on whether it was football season, and took care of everyone around him, whether they were the biggest geek in the class that nobody wanted to sit next to, or whether they were one of his best friends. It was important to him to protect people. And so when he slid down that slope, it was in a time where he was by himself away at college, and we did not realize what was going on. And as a family, if we knew then what we know now, likely things could have been changed. But what we did find out the day after we found out that Patrick had died by suicide was that the dorm manager, who was at the college he was at, saw all the signs, but didn't know what they were. That has to change. We can't have that. So I completely agree with all the prevention stuff. Don't get me wrong. But we need to start talking about our loss survivors as well. So I call myself a loss survivor. That is the term I use for myself. But a lot of other people will say suicide, survivor of suicide loss, suicide bereaved, or bereaved by suicide. It's all in what you feel. But I'm a loss survivor because I feel like that's what I've done. I've survived through the pain, and I'm here today. So when we're talking about grieving, one of the things that loss survivors truly need to understand, and those around them, everybody grieves differently, and that's okay. We forget that when we are talking about grief, and especially when we are talking about suicide deaths. Everyone gets to grieve however they need to. Sometimes that is a very short process, even with suicide death. Sometimes it's very long. Husbands and wives grieve differently, and they have to allow that to happen in order to stay together. We have to get to a place in our society where suicide loss survivors understand that the grief that they are going through is not some sort of punishment or some sort of burden, but it is actually a natural part of losing a loved one to suicide. We also have to get to the point where we understand as a society that grieving the loss by suicide can be incredibly exhausting. And those people who are in our lives that are having that loss and grieving, we can't expect them to be doing what they would normally do at work, what they would normally do in the community, what they would normally, if they're students, how they would normally act in school. We can't rush them back into what would be normal for them. And we have to be very careful about that. We also have to be careful not to allow them to sit in a certain place and not move forward, but understanding how that grieving process works is incredibly important. One of the issues that we need to understand that in the grief process people need is one-on-one communications. I can't stress this enough. After we lost our son Patrick, there was nobody that I had to talk to. There was no one that I could turn to. And that is incredibly difficult when you are grieving a loss, to have someone who, and I've lost parents and I've lost siblings, but to say to someone, I'm so sorry, I know exactly how you feel, I lost my dad, when I'm grieving the loss of my son. Not only am I grieving the loss of my son chose to go. So in order to make sure that we are helping our loss survivors, setting up programs that are one-on-one communications, AFSP has an amazing program that is called Healing Conversations. Literally, we train survivors to talk with the newly bereaved, to have safe conversations with. If you've lost a child, you talk to someone who's lost a child. That is incredibly important. It is one of the best programs, one of the most underutilized programs. But those one-on-one conversations are huge. Lack of resources. Now, we're not even going to touch on right this second the lack of people who are out there who provide services. What we're going to talk about is the lack of resources for something that I can look at, a piece of paper that I can have that can give me some ideas. And if we do have those resources, the problem is those people who have the resources have no idea how to get it in the hands of the loss survivor. That is one of the things that we need to work on. And then, of course, lack of providers. It is huge. Not only do we have a lack of providers, but we have loss survivors who have no idea how to go out and find someone to help them, how to decide when is the important time to do that, how to make sure that they are doing what they need to do in order to stay safe. And that's problematic. So this bridge that we're trying to make from very upstream to very downstream includes all of that. And we have to do better. We also have to remember that self-care is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for for loss survivors, and it's incredibly important for us as individuals. One thing I want to stress is that loss survivors and the people who are around them, it is incredibly important to say the lost loved one's name. I can't tell you how long it took before someone actually said the name Patrick to me. In fact, there were people, not my son, who were named Patrick, and people would just say, oh, you know, the athletic director at the school. I know you know his name is Patrick. but you're not saying it because you know I lost my son Patrick. We can't do that. One, because it's obvious what's happening. Two, if you say my son's name, then I know he's not forgotten. And that's an incredibly important thing for a loss survivor, to know that the person they've lost is not forgotten by everyone around them. And that's why the other thing I will tell you, if you are around a loss survivor and you know that person that they've lost, tell them a story about that person. Tell them a story because they don't get any new memories. And even though that's a memory for you, it's not for them. And so if you're telling them a story they've never heard before, that is an incredibly, I can't even tell you how much of a gift that is. It is a gold nugget in their lives because they get that piece that they didn't have. And I have a new memory that I never thought I would have a new memory of Patrick. And so that's incredibly important. So one thing that we want to remember is that loss survivors and that exposure to suicide is incredibly detrimental to them. They have higher risks of suicide. They have higher risks for being more introverted than they ever were. They are at higher risk for dying by suicide and having mental health issues. So we need to be proactive as a community. One way that we can do that is to make sure that we are providing some sort of group for them. Support groups. I will tell you, in my own experience, the last thing I wanted to do was go and talk in front of a bunch of people. The best thing I did was go talk in front of a bunch of people. And so as much as coming up here and talking today, had you told me 9 years, 9 months, and 1 week ago that this is where I would be, I would have laughed in your face, crawled back in bed, and told you to go pound sand, because that's never going to happen. The most cathartic thing you can do is have these conversations, talk about your loved one, talk about the loss, and doing that by attending a group is important. An in-person group would be wonderful. However, there are ups and downs to an in-person group. If you are in person, one, you have the chance of running into those people at the grocery store, at Walmart, at Kmart, when you are not in a place to have that conversation or to even think about it, and that's hard. You also have to be in the right frame of mind at the right time in order to do that, and that is incredibly hard. Virtual groups. Again, there are good and bad. Virtual groups provide you the opportunity to be in your pajamas, in your comfy chair, on your computer, having a conversation with people who have the same loss as you. Incredibly important. You don't get to hold their hand. You don't get to give them a hug. And more importantly, you don't get to get a hug if you need it. So again, I stress, there is good things and bad things about in-person and virtual groups. But the need to talk with someone is so incredibly important that whichever way you go, you have to make sure that we're providing those in the community, or you are making sure that your loss survivors in your community know about some of these virtual groups. Again, I do want to stress our Healing Conversations program, because that literally is a one-on-one conversation with someone who has the same loss as you. I'm not going to lie, loss survivors are some of the absolute most strong people I have ever met. And I tell you that because what you don't realize is how strong most of them have to be during normal conversations with everyday people. A lot of times loss survivors end up being the person who has to be strong in that conversation. I have had people come up to me and talk to me about the loss of my son and start crying and telling me how sorry they are, and then all of a sudden I have to take care of them. That happens all the time to loss survivors. Be careful about that. It's great to say, I'm so sorry for your loss. What can I do to help you? That's fantastic. But don't force them to be the strong person in that conversation. Let me explain it a little better by telling you a story from my life. So when I had lost Patrick, I was probably about 2 months out, and I thought I was doing pretty good. And I was going to be fine, and I was taking care of myself. And I went into one of my supervisor's office, and she looked at me and she said, "You have two choices today. You can drive yourself to the doctor and get some help, or I can drive you." She literally saved my life. She told me, "Hey, you're doing a great job, and I love everything you're doing, but I see you breaking apart in front of me." I was scared to go to the doctor because I was very afraid for the reaction I would get. The doctor I ended up seeing that day was amazing. His nurse was amazing. When I went in and said, "I'm sleeping about a half an hour a night, probably not all at the same time, 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there." She's like, "Well, do you know why you might be doing that?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, my son died by suicide a couple months ago." And she was like, "I'm so sorry to hear that. Let's see what we can do." And then she went and got the doctor. The doctor came in, sat, talked with me, was very, very compassionate, very kind, got me the sleep aids I needed, made me promise to get into counseling and potentially get on medication. Then called me 2 weeks later to make sure that I had scheduled the appointments. And I had. And so then that engagement was amazing. And I tell you that story to tell you this story. The next time I was at that same clinic, different doctor, I had bronchitis. I knew I had bronchitis. I've had bronchitis before. I know when I have bronchitis. Doctors don't like for you to tell them that you have bronchitis. They actually like to diagnose for some reason. They don't want to just take your word. So the doctor came in and he was talking to me a little bit condescending, a little bit, "Well, let's see what we're doing." He was flipping through my chart while he was doing that conversation. I know the second he saw that I had been in previously for Patrick's death. I know because he started stuttering. He closed the file. He no longer made eye contact with me. And all of a sudden, he knew that I had bronchitis, and his nurse was going to come in and do a nebulizer treatment, and he left the room immediately. Had that been my first encounter, had I not known the other reaction was there and available, I don't know that I would be okay right now. I don't know that I would have scheduled that counseling appointment and gotten on the medication I needed. That is how strong loss survivors are, is that those two instances could have completely crushed a loss survivor. But thankfully, I was on the other end of that. As a society, we need to do better. We need to not have our loss survivors trying to take care of us, who are not loss survivors, in that conversation. We need to be taking care of them. We need to make sure they are getting what they need. So how do we do that? As a community, how do we move forward with making sure that we are supporting loss survivors? The first thing, we need to stop working in silos. No one organization or entity has the solution to the suicide problem. It's too vast, it's too big, it has too many working parts. And when you only focus on one part, you can potentially do a lot of damage to the other parts that are out there. And so we need to make sure that things like this Ortus Foundation Symposium are happening, and we are working together, and we are making new friends and making new accomplices in this work, to be brutally honest. We need to stop blaming and shaming our loss survivor families. We need to stop asking the question, did you see the signs? What signs did you miss? Are you sure you didn't miss any signs? Those are all questions I've been asked. I've also been asked, are you getting ready to have another baby? Or are you going to try and have another baby? Because I lost my child. My daughters were 23 at the time, and my son was 19 when he died. So probably one of the most baffling questions I got asked after the loss of my son, only to be topped by the person who came up to me and apologized profusely that my son wasn't in heaven because he had killed himself. That's what loss survivors deal with in our community. Now, that person was treated to my very calm, I was proud of myself, response of, you know what, I'm sorry the God you pray to would allow someone not to be in heaven because of the way they lived, or the way they died and not the way they lived. But there's a lot of people who would be under the bus from that, because that was literally within a month of Patrick's death. So think about, as a community, how we can uplift, and we're not blaming or shaming. We need to stop stereotyping suicide loss as broken families, drug addicts, alcoholics, people who aren't very bright, people who can't cut it in this world, people who are weak. None of that is true. None of it. And so we need to stop making those stereotypes. And I know the stereotypes are there so that people can feel more comfortable that it's never going to happen to their family. But it can happen in any family. It's really not prejudice against anything. So we need to get that out of our language. We need to lead with compassion in everything and make sure that whatever it is we're doing it with compassion. Again, let's stop working in silos. Let's have conversations around these issues. Let's make sure that we are talking about mental health and suicide the same way we would talk about anything else. It's amazing to me when I come to these conferences and I can have these conversations where someone's not turning their back or looking down or looking around and trying to make sure that they're not actually making eye contact when I'm starting to talk about suicide deaths. So that's what we need our entire communities to be doing. That is vitally important. And so we need to somehow make sure that we get there. We need communities that are talking about their health, not their mental health, not their physical health. They're talking about their health. And their health is important. And no matter what it is that is wrong, they need to seek help. So I would not be doing my job at AFSP if I did not point out some of the lost survivor resources that we do have. I talked about the Healing Conversations program. After a Suicide brochure is something that has a lot of great information for suicide loss survivors. We also have our International Survivor of Suicide Loss Day that is actually coming up. It's the Saturday, in most places, it is the Saturday before what we call American Thanksgiving, because it truly is international. And it's just a time to support loss survivors as they walk into this really difficult holiday season. Because if you've never lost someone and then had to go through Thanksgiving or Christmas, I bow down to you, because that is one of the hardest things that we've done. And then, of course, the Children, Teens, and Suicide Loss book. When you're a loss survivor and you're trying to deal with that as either a parent or a grandparent, and you have teens or children in your house, making sure that they're supported is incredibly difficult. And so that is a book that kind of helps out with that. All of our prevention education programs and our resources are free. Doesn't matter who you are, if you're an individual or a business or a company or a school district, we will give you this stuff for free. We don't want there to be any barriers. So please let me know, or Katie, my amazing human out there, if you are interested in that. The last thing I want to do is I want to show you what support for a loss survivor looks like. Because this is how you support someone. This is what you do. You show up. You be there, you give the hug, you make sure that you are treating our loss survivors the same as anyone else. And that is so incredibly important when we are talking about making sure that our communities are supporting. That is the way to do it. Make it normal. Make it not something we want to deal with, but not something we're scared of talking about. And that's how important all of these people are in my life. Thank you.